Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Shift. This is your first time here. We would love it if you would scan this QR code, fill out that Connect card, and then we'll send you some free Opus coffee. And make sure you check out the Coffee with Joe option. That way you can meet him either in person or online, and you can ask any and all questions that you want or need to know. Have you reserved your tickets yet for 1946 the movie? Well, why not? They're traveling all across the US, and they're gonna be in Jacksonville on August 14th. So you can go ahead and scan this code to get your ticket, your free ticket, before they're all gone. Come on, people. Our small groups will be kicking off after the holiday season in September. Registrations open up on August 11th, and all throughout this season, we're gonna be highlighting one group. So make sure you keep an eye out for those highlights here and on our social media pages. Today, we kick off Summer Jams by starting with Take On Me by Aha. And don't forget that on August 25th is gonna be our Cosplay Sunday. Cosplaying basically just means dressing up for you older folks who don't know what cosplay means. So pick a song or pick a genre, and then you just get to dress up as that song or the genre or music from that time period. And now, here is Take On Me by Aha.
Welcome to Shift. If you are new online, my name is Joe, and I'm the lead pastor here. And we are kicking off our series, Summer Jams, which for me is my favorite series of the entire year. It's just a fun way for us to wrap up the summer together. This year, we're doing one-hit wonders, and what we did is we took all of these one-hit wonders, and people were able to just to nominate any song. And then on our virtual campus, which is our private Facebook page, we did a series of votes where people kind of voted on the top 10 here and then the top 8 here, and whittled it down to 4 songs. And those 4 songs are the ones we're going to be talking about: Take On Me, Tainted Love, Somebody That I Used to Know, and Don't You Forget About Me. And the premise of Summer Jams is to take a deep dive into these songs that we all love, and then look at the universal themes that are in these songs that cause us to love them as much as we do. And today we're taking a look at Take On Me. Now, if you're new, we normally begin each gathering with a time of kind of centering and reflection to kind of ground ourselves in the present. And I'm not going to quite do that today because it might be a little awkward online. But what I would ask for you to do is, if you're able to kind of just pause the teaching and maybe just kind of ground yourself where you're at and ask yourself, what is it that you need from this time together? And what is it that you need from me? Pay attention to the things that really stick out to you, to the things that resonate with you. And then at the end, we'll give you a moment to just kind of think through that and to kind of think about what that exactly means for you. Now, the song Take On Me, it's a song by the Norwegian synth pop band Aha. The original version, which was recorded in 1984 and released in October the same year, was a total failure. It was redone and released again in September of 1985. That time it reached number 2 in the UK singles charts in October. In the United States, in October of that year, 1985, the single topped the Billboard's Hot 100, and it became a sensation on MTV because of director Steve Barron's groundbreaking music video that featured the band that you saw earlier in that live action pencil sketch. That video won 6 awards and was nominated for 2 others at the 1986 MTV Music Awards. And every time I hear this song, it transports me back to my childhood and all of the good things about being a kid in the 80s, like staying out until the streetlights came on at night, Saturday morning cartoons, camping out in the backyard, Hulk Hogan and Andre Giant, the amazing music that helped define the decade. Oh, and don't forget the clothes. You can't forget what we wore in the 80s. And for some reason, fanny packs are back in style again. You're welcome, I guess. In fact, let's just thank Gen X for all of the amazing things that they came up with, and all of the amazing things that are back in style because of Gen X. Gen X, there will never be another generation like you. Thank you for being the best generation ever to walk the face of the earth. And on behalf of all Gen Xers, let me say thank you and you're welcome. Now, There's nothing particularly spiritual about this song, Take on Me. It's actually a pretty straightforward love song. If anything, it's a little cheesy, right? And what really sets it apart was the animation in that video. However, like any enduring work of art, there's got to be something to the song that's caused it to be placed among the most iconic of songs, right? And whether we realize it or not, this song speaks to a deep yearning for connection and intimacy that we all relate to. And I think the heart of the song is really captured in the second verse. This is what it says. So needless to say, I'm at odds and ends, but I'll be stumbling away, slowly learning that life is okay. Say after me, it's no better to be safe than sorry. Underneath all of the bubblegum poppiness of the 80s is a confession of deep vulnerability and a willingness to take a risk on something beautiful. And there can be no risk without vulnerability. To take a risk to open yourself up to the possibility of failure, to the possibility of going down in flames, is vulnerability. And I love that line that ends the second verse. It's no better to be safe than sorry. When my family and I moved here in like 2012, 2013, there was this older gentleman that attended the church that we were a part of. And his name was Larry. Some of you knew Larry that were here in Gainesville. He passed away a few years ago. And there was just a handful of us at his funeral. Larry had a pretty rough childhood. His parents gave him up to his grandparents to be raised by them, but not as siblings, just him. For a large part of his early life, he grew up away from his family, with his grandparents, who were not the nicest of people, very strict. But he grew up away from his mom and dad. His dad was an abusive alcoholic, and he lived in Germany. His siblings, Larry's brothers and sisters, resented him for this, and it was a point of contention throughout his entire life. And I don't know if it was that early abandonment that Larry felt, but Larry seemed incapable of taking a risk. He always chose the safest options. Um, Always. Like at one point, he had the opportunity to buy and run a movie theater um, that he worked at in Hollywood. And I can remember him talking about all the time, all these stories about all these bigwigs that would come in, these movie stars and directors and producers that would come in and watch their movies, or they would have premieres or different things, and how he kind of got to rub shoulders with them. And the owner took a liking to Larry. They got along really well. And when it came time for the owner he wanted to retire, he gave Larry the option to buy and run that movie theater. And it was literally everything that he wanted to do. And yet he was unwilling to take that risk and bet on himself. Larry spent his entire life in that cycle, never taking a risk, never willing to be vulnerable, never willing to bet on himself. And you know what he told me before he died? And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that he had wished he had taken some risks. His life hadn't turned out the way that he wanted it to. And looking back, it was because he was too scared to try. It's no better to be safe than sorry. In Matthew's account of Jesus's life in chapter 25, we see one of the clearest teachings on what Jesus finds to be important in life. In the chapter, there are three different stories that are told: the parable of the bridesmaids, the parable of the three servants, and the parable of the sheep and goat. Now, all three of those stories speak to the importance of what we do here on earth as part of the kingdom of heaven. And to get a full picture of what Jesus believes, you need to read all three, but for the sake of time, I want to focus on one: the parable of the three servants. In the story, we see a master with three servants, and the master is getting ready to go on a long trip and gives each of his servants a bag of silver. And they are trusted to take those bags of silver and do something with them to earn more silver. And the master leaves. And it says that the first servant, who was given 5 bags, he invested them and earned 5 more. The second servant was given 2 bags, and then he went to work and earned 2 more. But the final servant was only given 1 bag, and that servant decided to just hide the money and not do anything with it. And when the master came home And so that the first two servants had done what they had done with the silver, he was really pleased and said this in verse 23. The master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount. So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." Then he comes to the third servant, the one who did nothing, the one who played it safe and buried the silver. This is a really harsh story, and it comes across that way. The servant tries to explain why he chose to bury the silver and that he was afraid of losing the money. But the master says that if he were so afraid of losing it, why didn't you at least just put it in the bank? Because I would have at least gained some interest. In verse 28, the master says this. Then he ordered, "Take the money from the servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's no better to be safe than sorry." First, let me say that this story is not about the afterlife. The servant is not being tossed into hell. It's a parable. And this is a metaphor because everything spiritual can only be understood in metaphor. But the story is basically three people that are given differing levels of opportunities to take risk, differing levels of chances to be vulnerable, right? Two of them take the chance and received praise and reward for doing so. One doesn't and also receives the reward. Now, that might sound harsh, but let's examine that. Near the end of his life, my friend Larry asked me to meet him for coffee. We met at Bagel Bakery here in town. If you're local, you know where that's at. And it was a cool morning. So we decided to sit outside. And by that time, Larry was having real difficulty swallowing. He had had cancer of the throat, and it was really taking its toll. So we just sat there and we took our time. And he wanted to talk with me, wanted to meet with me, wanted to talk about the fact that he was worried about meeting God. He was worried, was he good enough to get into heaven? Or would he get up there, and God would tell him, "Nope, sorry, off you go." And I tried to encourage him as much as I could that that's not how it works. And I tried to ease his mind, ease his heart. But he had heard a lifetime of teachings like this story found in Matthew 25 and had been taught that if you don't use your talents for God, that you'll be thrown into outer darkness. And it was a reminder of when metaphors and parables are used to manipulate people, they just create just so much harm. And I think one of the most damaging ways that we can read stories like this is as if they are true, as if they are literal. And the truth of the wisdom found in these parables are deep and vast. And there's no one way to understand. There is no correct or right answer, and this is the only correct or right answer. So no, I don't believe that if we don't use our talents, that God will throw us into hell. But what if part of the truth or wisdom in the story is that we can create our own hell if we don't use our talents? What if what Larry experienced at the end of his life was what the third servant was experiencing in this story? And one of the problems with reading it literal is that we will read that the master is God. And if that's God, then he is a cruel God. And that's the whole reason the third servant was scared to do anything with the silver. He was afraid of what the master would do to him if he didn't produce. It's why Larry felt like he did looking back on his life. And I won't read it that way because the master in this story doesn't align with who we see in Jesus. The New Testament letter Colossians says that the fullness of God was in Christ, like he was our clearest representation of who God is. So the master cannot be God because that doesn't look like Jesus. And people do read it that way, but for me, it's not beneficial. So if you look at the three stories in this chapter, they build on each other. The first two stories focus on what we do while we wait for the coming of God's kingdom. And the third is the king's response to what those things are. And with that in mind, I'm going to invite us to reimagine this ancient story, as is the Christian tradition. Did you know that Take on Me almost never made it? It was recorded multiple times. I mentioned that earlier, and even released in the UK once. The original title of this song was Lesson One, and then it was changed to, listen to this, All's Well That Ends Well and Moves Well, and Moves with the Sun. All's Well That Ends Well and Moves with the Sun. That was the name of the song. They recorded it twice. Aha recorded it twice, both times failing miserably. And honestly, if you read the history of this story, I'm really surprised that they didn't just move on. I'm really surprised that the recording label allowed them to keep trying it, because apparently those first two recordings were awful. But they did. They kept pushing, and for some reason they really believed in the song and they were willing to take a risk on it. The band themselves talked about really pushing to try again, and they could have just given up, right? But they didn't. They were willing to take a risk, to keep pushing and put themselves out there, to be vulnerable and to risk their entire reputation on a song that they believed in. The third time was the charm. They were signed with Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers hired director Steve Barron, who was the one that came up with the concept of that iconic video that really launched the song Take on Me into the stratosphere. Again, they could have seen the failure and just given up and moved on. And nobody would have blamed them, right? Like, I'm sure that any one of us in the same situation probably would have done the same thing. But if they had, they would have missed out on making one of the most iconic songs of the era. And here we are, almost 40 years later, 1 year shy of 40 years later, still talking about this song. Instead of the band looking back on what could have been, they're looking back on what they did and how it changed their lives. And I read the story Jesus tells about this, and I see the master as time. Time is cruel and relentless. It waits for no person and respects no one. And if you don't take the risk of being vulnerable, if you don't take what's been given to you and do something with it, you'll not get a second chance. You'll be like that band if they had given up. You'll look back on what could have been instead of what was and what was accomplished. I sat with Larry at that table, sitting outside of that bagel bakery, and listened to him talk about the hell that he had created for himself. I don't know why he never took a risk, but there he sat in front of me at the end of his life, looking back and seeing nothing but what ifs. He was the third servant. He took all that life had given him, all the talents that he had, all the dreams and ambitions, and for the most part, buried them. He was so afraid of what might happen that he created a life where nothing did happen. Larry was sitting right in front of me, but don't doubt it for a second that he was in outer darkness. He had created his own personal hell, one that had him weeping and gnashing his teeth at the prospect of standing before a God who he believed would see his life as wasted. So many wasted opportunities. It was just a few weeks after that conversation that Larry took his last breath on this earth. And a few of us were in the room with him during those final days and hours. And here's what I remember. Here's what really stood out to me. Lying in front of me in that hospice room was a man who spent his final days and weeks regretting what he didn't do. So much so that he couldn't see what he did do. The people in that room shared story after story after story of how loving and kind Larry was. He was the type of person that would literally give you the shirt off of his back. He actually had people move in with him to help him so that he could help them get back up on their feet. And a few times he got taken advantage of, but that never stopped him from trying to help. Never stopped him from reaching out, never stopped him from loving other people. Now, Larry was far from perfect, all right? If you knew him, you know that he was an odd little dude. And I say that with all the love in my heart I have for him, but if you know, you know. But Larry's personal hell was so intense that he couldn't see past his mistakes to realize just how much he actually did do. But I think that's what time and regret does. It creates an outer darkness so deep that we often don't see or can't see or won't see the good things that we actually have done. And I think that's part of the wisdom that we find in this parable. Not only the wisdom, because these stories are endlessly knowable. And I think that's part of how Jesus set up this parable, how he set up this story. Notice the amount given to each person differs. Some have more and some have less, but the reward stays the same. Because life is also the master in this story, and life gives us different gifts and different levels of those giftings. The point isn't how much you're given, it's what you do with what you got. The person who had 5 and the person who had 2 did something with their gifts, and both were praised. They were praised not for the amount given back, but what they did with the things that they were given. Part of Larry's hell was that he believed he had to do some big, grandiose thing for him to be good, for these things to be good. He believed that you had to change the entire world and didn't understand, or maybe didn't know, that it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Take the good that you've been given and do something with it. Anything. Take the risk. Be vulnerable. The world needs that now more than ever. We are so polarized and so entrenched that when someone comes along risking kindness and vulnerability, it is a shock to the system. Think Mr. Rogers, right? Bob Ross, Keanu Reeves, Princess Diana, Mother Teresa, Oprah Winfrey. In a world that prioritizes relentless ambition, it is an incredible risk to be kind. The ones that get ahead will step on anyone to do it. They'll take advantage of every loophole to hoard more and more. They will lie, cheat, and steal to get what they want. But it's those that are willing to be loving and kind and generous who change the world. I would rather have one Steve Irwin than a million Elon Musks. If the point of the parable is to take what's been given to us and do something with it, I can think of nothing greater than to take the risk of being kind, of being loving. It takes strength and courage to show that kind of vulnerability. And it doesn't have to be in the big and the loud and the bombastic. It's in the everyday things, in the everyday normality that will make the greatest impact and give the biggest return. Showing kindness in today's divided culture isn't just kindness, it's an act of resistance. It's saying, I will not participate in the cruelty of our day. I will not be party to the weaponized inhumanity of the religious right. And I refuse to take part in othering people to get more views, to get more likes. Open doors, say thank you, look people in the eye, be present, give compliments, let people into the lane, give somebody a smile, give that person the dollar. I could go on and on and on. If there is any truth to be had in this story, it's found in the acts of love that it propels us to. All of you watching from all over the place, determined to not give in to the malice of our time and taking the risk to be kind, to make a difference with love, to be vulnerable in the face of overwhelming might. That's what's going to change the world. Not us being perfect or coming from places of strength, but knowing that we can take what we've been given and make this world better through our acts of love and kindness, willing to risk vulnerability. Larry worried that his kindness wasn't big enough, that he wasn't good enough, that he should have been perfect. But like the song says, so needless to say, I'm at odds and ends, but I'll be stumbling away, slowly learning that life is okay. Say after me, it's no better to be safe than sorry. Normally, we would end with a time of reflection. However, today, I think I'm going to leave that to you. I want you to take a moment and think about what your intention for this time together was. What stood out to you? What resonated with your heart? In what ways will you resist the cruelty of our age? These are the ways that God will work in and through you. These are the way that the Christ spirit, the Christ consciousness lives within us. It's in the small and big everyday moments where we choose to take risk, to risk vulnerability, where we choose to be kind. So let's pray. God of light and love, thank you for your wisdom found in the deepest of stories and in the cheesiness of 80s music. I pray that we would risk being vulnerable in a culture that calls for rigid masculinity as a marker for righteousness. May our vulnerability lead others to your endless love. And do not let our hearts become callous. Keep them malleable to your kindness. And let us be wise in the way we use the time given to us. Don't let us waste it worrying about what ifs. Give us the strength and the courage to take risks, to love well, and to be kind. Forgive us for things done and for things left undone. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear. Bring comfort to the afflicted, healing to the broken, and freedom to the chained. In your name, amen.